Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our stories. His rough fingers slid down my neck, and I felt every hair on my body stand on end in response. The smell of motor oil and expensive cologne created an intoxicating mix that clouded my senses. How could someone who had always controlled everything in her life lose control so completely in the arms of a man who represented everything I should despise? "You shouldn't be here," he murmured against my ear, his husky voice sending waves of heat through my body. "People like you don't mix with people like me." "Shut up," I replied, pulling him up by his grease-stained shirt. "For the first time in my life, I don't want to think." When his lips touched mine, I knew I had crossed a line from which there would be no return. The kiss tasted of danger and freedom, two things my privileged life had never afforded me. His strong hands held me as if I was going to break, a surprising gentleness coming from someone with such a rebellious appearance. The contrast between the softness of his lips and the roughness of his stubble created such an intense sensation that I found myself sighing against his mouth. That kiss sealed our fate, and to think it all started with a broken Lamborghini and my explosive temper. My name is Alexander Mitchell, and at the age of 35, I ran a financial empire that I had built practically single-handedly. Forbes magazine called me the prodigy of the new economy, and my fortune was estimated at a few billion. Apartments in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, private jets, luxury cars. I had everything money could buy and nothing that really mattered. That morning, I was driving my yellow Lamborghini Aventador through the streets of Manhattan when a strange noise started coming from the engine. For someone as obsessive as me, this was unacceptable. My official dealership was closed for refurbishment, and my assistant suggested a garage in Brooklyn, saying that the owner was a genius with Italian cars, despite his peculiar temperament. I pulled up in front of a modest-looking shed with a simple sign, "Mike's Garage, Import Car Specialist." The place didn't inspire confidence, but I was out of options. When I entered the shed, I saw several luxury cars in different stages of repair. A man was leaning over the engine of a Ferrari, his broad back visible under an oil-stained black t-shirt. I couldn't see his face, only his defined arms covered in a few tattoos. "Excuse me," I called out in my usual tone of someone who is used to being attended to immediately. He didn't move. I said, "Excuse me," I repeated louder. "I heard you the first time," he replied without turning around, his voice low and disinterested. "I'm finishing something important here. Wait a minute or look elsewhere." I was stunned. No one ever spoke to me like that. Absolutely nobody. "Do you know who I am?" I asked, feeling the blood rise to my face. Finally, he stood up and turned to me. The impact was immediate. Messy dark hair, an untrimmed beard, intense dark green eyes, and a wry smile on his full lips. He must have been in his 30s, maybe a little younger. "I have no idea, and frankly, I don't care," he replied, wiping his hands on an already dirty cloth. "If you've come for the Lamborghini, park it in the corner and leave the key. I'll take a look when I've finished here." "Are you Mike?" I asked, still stunned by his attitude. "In person," he replied, turning his attention back to the Ferrari. "And you're—" "Alexander Mitchell," I said, waiting for the acknowledgement that never came. "Right, Mr. Mitchell, as I said, park there and come back tomorrow." "Tomorrow? Impossible. I need it sorted today." Mike sighed and finally looked at me directly. His eyes assessed me from top to bottom, and for some reason I felt exposed. "Let me guess," he said. "You've never heard no in your life, right? Well, first time for everything. I'm swamped with work. Your car will have to wait." Something about that man put me off. Maybe it was the way he wasn't intimidated by my presence, or the way his eyes seemed to see through my carefully constructed facade. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something I wasn't ready to admit. "I'll pay double your normal rate," I offered. A slow smile formed on his lips. "It's not about money, Mitchell. It's about respect, waiting your turn like everyone else." "You don't understand," I insisted. "I have important meetings in the next few days. I need the car." "I understand perfectly," he replied, crossing his arms in front of his chest. The movement highlighted his defined muscles. "You think your time is worth more than other people's. This Lamborghini is just another toy for you, while for other clients, it's the dream of a lifetime." His words hit me like a slap. The truth in them was undeniable, and that made me even angrier. You don't know anything about me, I retorted. I know enough, he said, turning back to the Ferrari. Type of suit, watch, posture. I've seen dozens like you. Give me the keys or take your problem somewhere else. Something stopped me from leaving. Maybe pride, maybe curiosity, or maybe the way his hands worked with precision in the bowels of that engine. Okay. I gave in, tossing the keys to him, who caught them in midair without even looking. But I'll be back at the end of the day. As you wish, he replied indifferently. Coffee on the corner is good in case you have to wait. I stormed out of the shop, feeling completely out of place. Who was that man to treat me like that? And why, despite my anger, couldn't I get his green eyes out of my head? I returned to the workshop in the late afternoon after spending the whole day distracted in meetings, thinking about that insolent mechanic. To my surprise, Mike was leaning over the open hood of my Lamborghini, concentrating like a surgeon in operation. Have you found the problem? I asked, approaching him. He looked up briefly. Sweat was sticking to his shirt, and his face had a glow that, for some inexplicable reason, I found fascinating. Faulty work by the dealership, he explained, pointing to a part. Someone did a half-assed job at the last checkup. I'm almost finished. I watched as he worked. Precise movements, total concentration. There was something mesmerizing about the way he treated the car, with respect, almost reverence. Where did you learn to do that? I asked, genuinely curious. I grew up in a garage, he replied, without looking away from the engine. My father fixed Chevys and Fords. I fix Ferraris and Lamborghinis. Life takes turns. Your father must be proud. A heavy silence settled in. He died 5 years ago, he finally said. Heart attack. He never got to see what I did with his workshop. The sudden vulnerability caught me off guard. I'm sorry, I said, and I really was. Mike shrugged, returning to his defensive posture. I don't need your pity, Mitchell. It's not pity, it's empathy, I replied. I lost my father early, too. He stared at me, perhaps trying to decide if I was being sincere. How did it become this? He asked, gesturing vaguely in my direction. That what? That kind of perfectionist tycoon who panics when his toy breaks. I should be offended, but something about his direct manner was refreshing after years of being surrounded by sycophants. My father was an accountant, I explained. He worked all his life for the same bank in Chicago, hoping for a promotion that never came. He died with a list of unfulfilled dreams. I swore it would be different with me. Mike nodded slowly, as if processing the information. For a moment it seemed that we had found common ground. So you replaced his list of dreams with a list of possessions, he asked, and there was no malice in his voice, just curiosity. The question unsettled me. No one had ever questioned me like that. It's not that simple, I replied defensively. It never is, he agreed, closing the hood of the Lamborghini. There, I've fixed the problem and done a complete overhaul. This dealership you use is ripping you off, you know that? How much do I owe? I asked, pulling out my credit card. Mike wiped his hands and looked at me with those disturbing green eyes. $8,000, he said. And I don't take cards, only transfer or cash. $8,000? I repeated, surprised. The dealership would charge at least twice as much. Like I said, they're ripping you off, he shrugged. I charge what's fair for the job, not for the name on the license plate. I made the bank transfer on the spot, watching him check his cell phone to confirm the payment. Thanks, he said, holding out the keys to me. When I took them, our fingers touched briefly. An electric current ran through my body, and I realized that he felt something too, as he quickly stepped back. If you have any other problems, you know where to find me, he said, turning to put his tools away. Actually, I began, not knowing exactly why. I have other cars that could use an overhaul. Mike looked over his shoulder at me, a smile slowly appearing at the corner of his mouth. Is that so? Or are you looking for excuses to come back here? I felt my face heat up. How could he read my intentions so easily? I just appreciate a job well done, I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. Of course, he smiled more openly. Well, my schedule is full for 2 weeks, but I can fit you in next Tuesday if it's urgent. Tuesday's fine, I replied too quickly. As I drove home that evening, the Lamborghini's engine purring perfectly, I couldn't stop thinking about Mike. There was something about him that intrigued me, challenged me, attracted me in a way I had never experienced before. And that scared me to death. For someone who had always planned every aspect of life, this sudden interest in a rebellious mechanic was completely off the script. But maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what I needed. Little did I know that Tuesday would change my life forever. If you're enjoying this story of an unlikely meeting between two different worlds, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe to the channel. We'll see how Alexander and Mike's relationship evolves when their universes begin to collide in unexpected ways. The days following my meeting with Mike were torture. I, who had always prided myself on my relentless focus on business, couldn't concentrate on anything. In meetings with investors, my mind wandered to those intense green eyes. During market analysis, I remembered the precise movement of his hands working on the engine. At night, I dreamt of that near touch of his fingers as he handed me the keys. On Monday, the day before our scheduled meeting, I received a call from my assistant. Alexander, Time magazine wants to do an article on the 40 most influential executives under 40E. I need to confirm your availability for the photo shoot on Tuesday. Tuesday, the day I would see Mike again. I can't make it on Tuesday. Reschedule, I replied dryly. But sir, they've already rescheduled twice and— Find another day, I interrupted, then hung up. What was happening to me? Postponing media exposure that would benefit my business to take a car to a mechanic? It was irrational. I tried to convince myself that it was just professional curiosity. I wanted to see Mike working on another one of my cars. Nothing more. When Tuesday finally arrived, I carefully chose my outfit. After trying on and rejecting several Italian suits, I opted for something more casual: dark designer jeans, a navy blue shirt, and a gray blazer. Casual, but still elegant. Why? I wasn't trying to impress anyone, I told myself. I chose to take my Aston Martin DB11 this time. There was a suspicious noise in the suspension. At least that's what I had convinced myself to believe. When I arrived at the workshop, Mike was sitting in a makeshift chair on the sidewalk, drinking coffee from a simple mug. He was wearing shabby jeans and a black t-shirt that highlighted his broad shoulders. His unkempt hair fell over his eyes, and he pushed it away when he saw me coming. Something about the way he moved, so nonchalant, so authentic, made my heart race. Punctual, he observed, glancing at the cheap watch on his wrist. I expected nothing less. I always keep my appointments, I replied, getting out of the car. Mike whistled low when he saw the Aston Martin. Nice toy, Mitchell. At least you have good taste. There's a noise in the rear suspension, I explained, trying to sound casual. He tilted his head, analyzing my face. Is that so? Or did you invent a problem to get back here? I felt my face heat up. How could he read me so easily? If you don't want the job, I began defensively. Mike smiled in that way that made my stomach turn. I didn't say that. Let's have a look. We entered the workshop together. The place was empty. Where are your other customers? I asked. Tuesdays are quieter, he explained, picking up some tools. I usually use them to catch up on paperwork, but I decided to fit you in. Why? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Mike stopped what he was doing and faced me squarely. Because you intrigue me, Alexander Mitchell. You have everything money can buy, but something seems to be missing. The directness completely disarmed me. No one in my life had ever been so direct with me. You don't know anything about my life, I replied, but without my usual conviction. I know how to recognize eyes that are looking for something they can't find, he said, turning his attention back to the car. I've seen a lot of those in my life. I watched as he drove the car onto a hydraulic elevator. His movements were fluid, confident. There was something deeply attractive about someone so sure of his abilities. And you? I asked, moving closer. Have you found what you're looking for? Mike gave a half smile. Some days yes, some days no, but at least I know what I'm looking for. Which is freedom, he replied simply. To live on my terms. No commitments other than the ones I choose to have. He started the elevator and the car began to rise. Mike bent down to examine the suspension, and I couldn't help but admire the way his body moved, agile, strong, with no wasted effort. I found your problem, he said after a few minutes. A loose screw in the suspension. 5 minutes to fix. Our gazes met under the car, and a heavy silence settled between us. Have you always been like this? I asked. How? Rebellious, indifferent to what others think. He seemed to consider the question seriously. When you grow up on my side of town, he began, picking up a tool, you learn quickly that people will judge you anyway. So why bother? It must be liberating, I commented, more to myself. And you? He asked, his piercing eyes studying me. Have you always been this impeccable tycoon? Not always, I admitted. There was a time when I was different. How different? I hesitated. Why was I about to share something I rarely mentioned? I grew up in Detroit, in a small apartment. My father worked at the bank, but we were lower middle class. I went to public school until I got a scholarship to a private one in high school. Mike stopped his work and looked at me with genuine surprise. Really? I thought you were some spoiled heir. No, I replied. I built everything from scratch. College on a scholarship, an internship at an investment bank, my first business with borrowed money. Something changed in his eyes. Perhaps a new respect, perhaps recognition. We seem to have misjudged each other, he commented, getting back to work. I guess so. He finished the adjustment and lowered the car. There you go. Problem solved. How much do I owe? I asked, reaching for my cell phone to make the transfer. Mike studied me for a moment, biting his lower lip slightly in a way that I found inexplicably attractive. Nothing, he finally replied. It was literally 5 minutes' work. I can't accept that, I insisted. Your time is worth money. Then pay me another way, he suggested, and my heart raced. Do you have lunch plans? We ended up in a small Italian restaurant a few blocks from the workshop. Nothing fancy, checkered tablecloths, empty wine bottles decorating the shelves, an old man playing the accordion in the corner. In any other situation, I would never have gone in there. But with Mike, it seemed perfectly appropriate. The owner is a customer, he explained as we sat down. I saved his vintage Ferrari 250 GT from being scrapped. Now he insists that I eat here regularly. Do you drive Ferraris much? Only repair, he replied. I prefer motorcycles, actually. Motorcycles? I asked, surprised. I thought someone who loves cars would have dozens of them. Mike shrugged. I don't need to own something to appreciate its beauty. Besides, on a motorcycle, I feel free. That word again. Something I, with all my wealth, rarely felt. The owner appeared, a robust Italian with an easy smile, and greeted Mike like family. He didn't even look at the menu before ordering. Apparently, Mike knew exactly what was best. The conversation flowed surprisingly well. We talked about cars, about New York, about books. I discovered that Mike was a voracious reader, another prejudice of mine shattered. He had strong opinions about Hemingway and Bukowski, authors I also enjoyed. I never imagined I'd meet a mechanic who quotes The Old Man and the Sea, I commented, taking a sip of wine. A flash of irritation passed across his face. And I never imagined a billionaire who wasn't completely boring, he retorted. It seems we both need to review our prejudices. He was right, and his honesty completely disarmed me. I'm sorry, I said sincerely. You're absolutely right. Mike relaxed, and his smile returned. It's all right. I'm used to it. People look at my greasy hands and assume that my brain is too. What about me? I asked, genuinely curious. What do you assume? He studied me for a moment, his intense green eyes fixed on mine. That you've built this fortress around yourself, the perfect suit, the perfect car, the perfect life, and now you don't know how to get out of it. His words hit me like a punch in the gut. How could he see so deeply into me? Maybe you're right, I admitted, more to myself than to him. And maybe you're here with me because something inside you wants to break down these walls, he suggested, leaning slightly towards me. The air between us seemed electrified. I could feel my heart beating against my ribs. I was about to say something when my cell phone rang, a call from my financial director. I need to take this, I muttered, frustrated by the interruption. The call was brief, but enough to break the spell of the moment. When I hung up, Mike had a more closed expression. Trouble in the kingdom? He asked with a slightly sarcastic tone. Nothing important, I replied. Where were we? You were about to go back to your world, and I to mine, he said, finishing his wine. That's how it works, isn't it? It doesn't have to be, I replied, surprised at my own audacity. Mike laughed, but there was no humor in his eyes. Alexander, people like you pass by people like me, have a bit of fun pretending to live a different life, and then go back to their penthouses and their private jets. The harshness in his voice caught me off guard. That's not what I'm doing. No? He stared at me defiantly. Then tell me, what exactly do you want from me? The question hung between us, heavy and unavoidable. What did I want? I didn't even know for sure. I enjoy your company, I answered honestly. Like an exotic experience? The billionaire and the mechanic? What an interesting story to tell at your gala dinners. No, I replied, more firmly now. I like how authentic you are, how you're not afraid to tell me the truth, how you seem completely comfortable with yourself. Mike was silent for a moment, processing my words. And what do we do with that? He finally asked, his voice softer. We could start with another lunch, I suggested. Or dinner. A small smile touched his lips. Dinner? Like a date? It was my turn to be speechless. Was that it? A date? If you want to call it that, I replied, trying to sound casual. What about your rich friends, your carefully constructed image, your reputation? He pressed. I'm not asking for your hand in marriage, Mike, I replied, trying to ease the tension. It's just dinner. He studied me for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether I was worth the risk. Right, he finally agreed. One dinner, but on one condition. What? I choose the place. And you come with me on a motorcycle. My stomach knotted up. I'd never ridden a motorcycle in my life. By motorcycle? I repeated. His smile widened, almost predatory. Scared, Mitchell? The challenge in his eyes was impossible to resist. All right, I agreed. When? Friday, 8 p.m., I'll pick you up at your office. I exchanged phone numbers with him and gave him the address of my office. As we left the restaurant, there was a strange tension between us, like a taut thread about to snap. See you Friday, then, he said, holding out his hand. Instead of shaking my hand, Mike reached over and lightly adjusted the collar of my blazer. The casual touch sent a wave of warmth through my body. See you Friday, Alexander? He replied, using my first name for the first time. The sound of it on his lips was different, more personal. I watched him walk away, walking with that natural confidence that seemed to be part of him. This was going to be the longest week of my life. I spent the next few days in a state of anxiety I hadn't experienced since my first big deals. My assistant asked me twice if I was ill. I canceled a trip to London so as not to miss dinner with Mike. Rationally, I knew I was acting like a teenager, but I couldn't help it. On Friday, I left the office early to get ready. I changed my clothes 3 times, finally opting for something casual. Jeans, white cotton t-shirt, leather jacket. If I was going to ride a motorcycle, I'd at least try to look like I knew what I was doing. At 8 a.m. sharp, the building receptionist called, "Mr. Mitchell, there's a motorcyclist asking for you." I went downstairs nervously. On the sidewalk in front of the imposing corporate building in Manhattan, Mike was waiting leaning against a black and red Ducati Monster. He wore jeans, boots, a black leather jacket that looked like it had seen a lot of road, and held 2 helmets. Our gazes met, and he smiled when he saw me. My heart raced in a way that no million-dollar deal has ever managed to provoke. "You came," he said, sounding genuinely surprised. "I told you I'd come," I replied, stepping closer. "Nice bike." "Thanks," he replied, stroking the handlebars as if they were something precious. "I built most of it with my own hands." I reached out to touch the bike, and our fingers brushed briefly. The electricity of that minimal touch was almost embarrassing. "Have you ever ridden a motorcycle before?" he asked, handing me a helmet. "Never," I admitted. His smile widened. "Then tonight will be full of firsts." The phrase, laden with innuendo, made my face heat up. Mike got on the bike and started it up. The powerful rumble echoed down the street. "Get on behind me," he instructed. "Hold on to my waist and follow my movements. Don't fight the curves." I clumsily climbed on, placing myself behind him. The forced closeness was both uncomfortable and exciting. I could feel the heat of his body, the smell of leather and men's cologne. I hesitated as I put my hands on his waist. "Come on, Mitchell," he teased. "This is no time to be shy." I took a deep breath and held onto his waist. Mike accelerated, and the bike sped down the avenue. The sudden movement made me grip him tighter, practically hugging him from behind. I could feel the muscles in his stomach under my hands. The first few minutes were pure terror. The speed, the wind, the cars passing so close. But then something changed. The adrenaline turned into pure euphoria. The wind, the city lights, the feeling of freedom. It was intoxicating. Mike drove skillfully through the streets of New York, snaking through traffic as if the bike were part of him. At a traffic light, he turned briefly towards me. "Everything okay back there?" "Better than I thought," I shouted over the roar of the engine. He smiled and accelerated again. We took the Brooklyn Bridge, then followed the coast. I had no idea where we were going, and for the first time in years, I didn't mind not being in control. After almost an hour's ride, we arrived in a remote part of the city. Mike parked the bike in front of a building that looked like an old warehouse converted into a restaurant. Yellowish lights illuminated the place, and live music could be heard from inside. I got off the bike, my legs slightly shaking, not from fear, but from excitement. I took off my helmet and ran my hand through my hair, trying to tidy it up. "Well?" asked Mike, also removing his helmet. "Motorcycle verdict?" "Incredible," I replied honestly. "I've never felt anything like it." He smiled, pleased. "Welcome to my world, Alexander." The restaurant was rustic, with wooden tables, low lighting, and simple decor. A group was playing live blues on the small stage. None of the regulars seemed remotely interested in who I was, and I found that strangely liberating. "What is this place?" I asked as we sat down at a far table. "A well-kept secret," he replied. "The owner is a musician who dropped everything to live here. The food is simple but incredible, and the music even better." A waitress approached and greeted Mike by name. He ordered craft beers and a few dishes to share without looking at the menu. "Do you come here often?" I asked when she walked away. "When I need to think," she replied, "or when I want to impress someone." "And what's the case today?" Her green eyes studied me intensely. "I guess both." The food arrived. Simple meat dishes, grilled vegetables, rustic potatoes. Nothing fancy, but all delicious. The beer was exceptional. We talked about music, motorcycles, and favorite places. I discovered that Mike had traveled the United States by motorcycle, alone for 6 months after his father's death. "It was like finding my way back," he explained. "After he died, I felt lost. The road helped me remember who I was." "It must have been incredible," I commented, imagining the freedom of such a journey. "It was," he agreed. "And what about you? What's the most liberating thing you've ever done?" I thought for a moment, sadly realizing that I didn't have a ready answer. "I think I'm doing it now," I answered sincerely. Mike stared at me, and a meaningful silence fell between us. The band started playing a slow ballad, and several people got up to dance. "Come on," he said suddenly, holding out his hand to me. "Dance?" I asked incredulously. "Why not? First time's day, remember?" I hesitated. Dancing with another man in public? Part of me, the part that always worried about appearances, about what others would think, resisted, but another part, one that seemed to grow more and more in Mike's presence, wanted to throw it all away. "I can't dance that," I admitted. "I'll teach you," he replied, his hand still outstretched. I took a deep breath and accepted his hand. He led me to a darker corner of the small makeshift dance floor. His hand rested gently on my waist, while the other held mine. The closeness of our bodies made my heart race. "Relax," he murmured, guiding me gently. "Just feel the music." I tried to follow in his footsteps, stumbling a few times. He laughed softly, but not mockingly. "Always in control, aren't you?" he teased. "It must be exhausting." "Sometimes," I admitted. "Then stop trying to control," he suggested. "Just go with it." I closed my eyes and allowed myself to be guided. His body was firm against mine, warm, present. The smell of him, a mixture of leather, clean sweat, and something uniquely his, invaded my senses. When I opened my eyes again, his face was dangerously close. His eyes had a glow that completely hypnotized me. The music ended, but we didn't move. Time seemed to have stopped. He leaned in slightly, his lips almost touching mine. I could feel his breathing. "Alexander," he murmured, almost a question. "Yes," I replied, not knowing exactly what I was agreeing to. The sound of applause for the band broke the moment. Mike pulled back slightly, his eyes still fixed on mine. Something had changed between us. An invisible line had been crossed. Even without the kiss we both clearly wanted. We walked back to the table in silence. The tension between us was palpable. We finished our drinks and Mike asked if I was ready to go. The motorcycle ride was different. I didn't hesitate to hold him, wrapping my arms around his waist with more confidence. He drove more slowly, as if he wanted to prolong our time together. When we finally reached my building, a feeling of emptiness came over me. "I'll take you up," he offered. In the elevator, we were silent. He followed me to the door of my apartment where we stopped. "Tonight was," I began, unable to find the right words. "Different?" he suggested. "Incredible," I corrected. We stood there, the tension growing by the second. I knew what I wanted, but I didn't know how to ask for it, how to take the next step. "What's going on here, Alexander?" asked Mike softly. "Between us? I don't know," I answered honestly. "But I want to find out." He moved closer, and my heart felt like it was about to explode. His hand touched my face, his thumb lightly tracing my jawline. The touch sent shivers throughout my body. "Are you sure?" he asked, "because once we cross that line—" "I am," I replied, surprising myself with my certainty. "Your perfect worlds could fall apart," he warned. "Maybe they need to," I replied. Mike smiled, a slow smile full of promise. Then, finally, he leaned in and his lips touched mine. The kiss began softly, almost hesitantly, but quickly deepened. My hands found his hair, while his pulled me around the waist, eliminating any space between us. The world around us disappeared. There was only Mike, his taste, his smell, the warmth of his body against mine. When we broke apart, we were both breathing heavily. "I should go," he whispered, although he made no move to move away. "Stay," I asked, the word escaping before I could think. His eyes darkened with desire, but he shook his head slightly. "Not yet," he replied. "When it happens, and it will, I want it to be because we're sure, not because we've been carried away by the moment." Part of me wanted to protest, to pull him in and not let him out. But another part, the part that was beginning to deeply respect this man, understood his hesitation. "When will I see you again?" I asked. "Soon," he promised, stealing another quick kiss. "Very soon." I watched him walk to the elevator, each step seeming to tear a piece out of me. Before entering, he turned around. "Alexander?" "Yes? Thanks for letting me show you a bit of my world today." And with that, he disappeared behind the elevator doors. I entered my apartment, spacious, elegant, and terribly empty. I walked out onto the balcony and looked down at the illuminated city below. For the first time in years, I felt that something was starting to change inside me. The controlling tycoon was losing control, and strangely, I didn't mind one bit. Over the next 2 weeks, Mike and I saw each other almost daily. Dinners in discreet restaurants, motorcycle rides through the New York night, long conversations in my apartment. Each encounter brought us closer together, breaking down barriers that even I didn't know I had built around myself. On one such evening, we were on the balcony of my apartment in Manhattan, gazing out at the illuminated city as we shared a bottle of wine. Mike was leaning back on the ledge, the moonlight highlighting the angles of his face. I never tired of looking at him, that perfect blend of strength and vulnerability that drew me like a magnet. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, noticing my long gaze. "How strange it is," I replied. "A month ago, I didn't even know you existed. Now I can't imagine my days without you in them." Mike smiled, that smile that still made my heart race. "Careful, Mitchell. It's starting to sound romantic." "What if it is?" I asked, surprising us both with my frankness. His smile disappeared, replaced by a more serious expression. He moved closer, putting his hands on my face. "Are you sure what you're saying? It's not just curiosity? It's not just a break in your perfect life?" Those questions hit me deep. They were the same ones I had asked myself countless times. "At first, maybe it was," I admitted. "You were so different from everything else in my life. But now—" I paused, searching for the right words. "Now you're the only thing that feels real." Mike kissed me then, a slow, deep kiss that seemed to seal some kind of pact between us. When we broke apart, his green eyes had a sparkle I'd never seen before. "Come with me," he said, taking my hand and leading me into the apartment, towards the bedroom. That night, We finally surrendered completely to each other. His hands, calloused from years of working on engines, ran over my body with surprising delicacy. Every touch seemed to awaken something dormant inside me. Our breaths, our bodies, our whispers, everything blended together in perfect harmony. Then, lying side by side, our bodies still joined by sweat and newfound intimacy, Mike traced invisible patterns on my chest with his fingers. "Do you know what I like most about you?" he murmured. "What?" "How you can have everything, but still seem to value the simplest things when you're with me." His words touched something deep in me. Maybe because the simplest things are the ones money can't buy. He smiled against my shoulder. "Who would have thought that billionaire Alexander Mitchell would be such a romantic?" "Only with you," I replied, pulling him closer. We fell asleep like that, entwined in each other, as if our bodies had been made to fit together perfectly. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. Mike was in the kitchen, wearing nothing but jeans, preparing breakfast. The scene was so domestic, so natural, that it caught me off guard. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what it would be like to have that every day, waking up with him, sharing meals, building a life together. "Morning, sleepyhead," he said when he saw me. "Coffee?" I moved closer and kissed him longingly. "Yes, please." We had coffee together on the balcony, talking about everything and nothing. Mike had to go back to the workshop. An important client was bringing a Bugatti in for servicing. I watched him get ready, put on his leather jacket, and prepare to leave. "When will I see you again?" I asked, hugging him at the door. "Tonight?" he suggested. "I've got tickets for a blues concert at the Village Vanguard." "Perfect," I agreed. After he left, I stood in the doorway for a few minutes, absorbing what was happening to me. I, Alexander Mitchell, control-obsessed workaholic, was completely in love with a rebellious mechanic who was turning my world upside down, and I didn't want it to be any different. Reality, however, has a cruel way of interrupting even the most perfect moments. That same afternoon, I was in a meeting with investors when my cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Caroline, my assistant. "Urgent. The New Yorker magazine wants to confirm rumors about your relationship with the Brooklyn mechanic. They have photos." My blood ran cold. I excused myself and left the room to call her. "What photos?" I asked as soon as she picked up. "Apparently someone photographed you leaving the Italian restaurant last week," she explained. "And there are others of you on the bike. The reporter is pressing for a position. He's mentioned that he's going to publish it anyway." My mind was racing. "Ask him to postpone any publication. Tell them I'm out of the country and we'll talk when I get back." "Alexander," said Caroline hesitantly, "you know this could affect negotiations with the conservative group in Singapore, don't you? They're quite traditional." The negotiation with the Singapore group was the biggest deal of my career. A merger worth almost $2 billion that I had been preparing for months. "I'll sort it out," I replied automatically, then hung up. I went back to the meeting, but I couldn't concentrate. My personal and professional lives were about to collide in a way I hadn't anticipated. For years, I had kept my private life just that, private, not out of shame, but because it was simpler, more manageable. Now with Mike, everything was exposed, vulnerable. After the meeting, I called him. "Hey," he answered in a cheerful voice. "I was thinking about you." "Mike," I began, my voice tense. "We have a problem." I explained about the magazine, the photos, the implications for the deal with the Singaporeans. As I spoke, I realized how I sounded, prioritizing business over us. "I see," he said after a long silence. "So, what do you want to do?" "I don't know," I admitted. "That could complicate a lot of things." "For your business," he added, his voice now distant. "Mike, it's not just that." "No, it's okay," he interrupted. "I always knew that our worlds would eventually clash. I just didn't expect it to be so soon." "Can we talk about it tonight?" I asked. "Sure," he replied, but there was a coldness in his voice that I didn't recognize. "I'll see you at 8. I spent the rest of the day anxious, torn between business worries and the fear of losing Mike. When I got home to get ready for the show, my cell phone rang again. It was Richard, my lawyer and longtime friend. "Alexander, I saw the photos," he said without preamble. "The New Yorker reached out to me for comment." "What pictures exactly do they have?" I asked. "You holding hands leaving the restaurant. You on the back of his motorcycle. and one that looks like you two kissing in the lobby of your building. I closed my eyes, feeling the panic rising. Richard, You don't have to explain anything to me, he interrupted. You know I don't care who you're in a relationship with, but Singaporeans? They've already expressed discomfort with previous rumors about your personal life. What do you suggest? There was a pause. You have options. You can deny it, say that the photos are manipulated or taken out of context. You can sue the magazine. Or you can ask for a break in this relationship, at least until the deal is done. Those words fell like stones in my stomach. Take a break? Hiding Mike as if it were something shameful? I need to think about it, I replied. I'll call you tomorrow. I hung up and sat in silence, my head throbbing. 8 o'clock was approaching, and I was no more ready to see Mike than I was to make a decision about us. The doorbell rang punctually at 8. When I opened the door, Mike was there, handsome in his leather jacket, but his usual smile was absent. He came in without kissing me, the first sign that something had changed between us. Would you like something to drink before we go? I offered. I think we need to talk first, he replied, taking a seat on the sofa. I sat down next to him, keeping a distance that seemed like an abyss. I've been thinking all day, he began, and I think I understand your position. Your business is important to you. Mike, it's not that simple. Actually, it is, he interrupted. It's a choice, Alexander. I always knew this moment would come, when you'd have to choose between your perfect world and what we have. I don't want to choose, I answered honestly. I want both. He gave a sad smile. Life rarely works out like that, especially for people like us. So different. We're not so different, I argued. No? His green eyes pierced me. So you'd be willing to introduce me to your friends, your family, your partners? Appear with me at your company events? Take me as your partner to that dinner with the Singaporeans? I didn't answer immediately, and my silence told him everything he needed to know. That's what I thought, he muttered. Mike, this isn't about you. It's exactly about me, he interrupted, standing up. Or rather, about who I am. The mechanic from Brooklyn doesn't fit into Alexander Mitchell's brilliant world. That's not fair, I protested, standing up too. I'm trying to balance things that are important to me. And where do I fit into that list of priorities? He asked, his voice breaking slightly. After business? After your public image? The question hit me like a punch. Where did he fit in? You're important to me, I replied, my voice lower. Important enough to risk $1 billion business? He pressed. Important enough to face public scrutiny? I swallowed, feeling cornered. I just need time to conduct things my way. Mike nodded slowly, as if finally understanding some fundamental truth. Do you know what the difference is between us, Alexander? I've never been ashamed of who I am. I've never had to hide anything about myself to please others. I'm not ashamed of you, I protested. No? His eyes were shining now, moist. Then why are we having this conversation? Why can't we just go to the show and deal with the consequences later? He was right, and that hurt more than I could express. I guess that answers my question, he said, heading for the door. I hope your deal with the Singaporeans works out. I really do. Mike, wait, I called, my voice almost pleading. Can't we find a compromise? Just until I finish this deal? He stopped, his hand on the doorknob, and turned to me. What would that middle ground be, Alexander? Meet in hiding? Me staying in the shadows of your public life? Be your dirty little secret? It's not that. It's exactly that, he interrupted. And I deserve more. So do you. With those words, he left, closing the door softly behind him. There was no drama, no shouting, just the devastating calm of goodbye. I ran out onto the balcony in time to see him leave the building, get on his bike, and drive off. The image of him disappearing into the New York night remained etched in my mind as a painful reminder of what I had just lost. That night, I didn't sleep. For the first time in years, I cried. For Mike, for me, for the choices we had made, and the ones we still had to make. The next 2 weeks were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and corporate decisions. The Singaporean representatives arrived in New York, and the negotiations entered their final phase. I smiled, shook hands, discussed contractual details, all on automatic, while inside I was completely empty. The New Yorker story was published, but Richard managed to minimize the damage. The photos were presented as an unusual friendship, between a billionaire and an automotive entrepreneur. Technically, it wasn't a lie. Mike really did own his own business. The Singaporeans didn't mention it directly, but I noticed suspicious glances during the dinners. It didn't matter. The business kept moving forward. I tried calling Mike several times, but he never picked up. I sent messages that were ignored. I even stopped by the workshop, but his assistant said he was traveling. Where or for how long, I couldn't say. The day before I was due to sign the contract with the Singaporeans, I was in my office going over documents when Caroline walked in. "Everything's ready for tomorrow," she informed me. "The conference room is booked, the press have been notified, and the champagne is ordered." "Great," I replied automatically. She watched me for a moment. "Can I say something? As a friend, and not as your assistant?" I looked at her, surprised. "Of course." "You look miserable," I said directly. "And since that mechanic walked out of your life." "Mike," I corrected automatically. "His name is Mike," she nodded. "Mike, the point is, I've never seen you like this because of a business deal that didn't work out, but because of a person." "What are you trying to say, Caroline?" "That maybe you're prioritizing the wrong things," she replied. "This business with the Singaporeans, it's important, yes, but in 10 years' time, what will matter more? Having closed this contract or having left someone who clearly meant a lot to you?" His words hit me deeply. "It's not that simple." "Actually, it is," she retorted, surprising me with her frankness. "You've built an empire, Alexander. It's time to build a life." After she left, I sat in silence, her words echoing in my mind. On the wall of my office, there was a picture of me on the cover of Forbes, the prodigy of the new economy. Next to it, framed, was the first contract I signed when I started my company. Symbols of success, of achievement, everything I always thought I wanted. But at that moment, I realized that I would give anything, the empire, the cars, the apartments, to have Mike back. I picked up the phone and called Richard. "I need you to come to my office now," he said. "We're going to make some changes to the contract with the Singaporean." 2 hours later, I left the office with a completely new plan. I didn't know if it would work, but for the first time in weeks, I felt alive again. The next morning, the conference room was packed. Singapore executives, lawyers, the financial press, all waiting for the signing of one of the biggest deals of the year. I entered the room at precisely 10 o'clock, wearing my best suit. I greeted those present and took my place at the head of the table. Richard gave me a nervous look. He still wasn't convinced of my plan. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, "before we sign the documents, I'd like to make a brief announcement." The main representative of the Singapore group, Mr. Tan, arched his eyebrows, surprised by the deviation from protocol. "As many of you know, I built this company from scratch based on principles of innovation, excellence, and, above all, integrity." I paused, observing the attentive faces around the table. Integrity means being true to who you are, even when it's inconvenient. It means making difficult choices based not only on business logic, but also on personal honesty. Mr. Tan leaned forward slightly, clearly trying to understand what I was getting at. "This deal is extremely important to me," I continued. "It represents years of work and will change our markets. Partnering with the Tan Group could revolutionize our position in the Asian market." Everyone nodded, agreeing with the obvious. "However," I continued, "I've recently discovered that there are more important things than business. Or rather, that business should reflect who we really are." "What are you trying to say, Mr. Mitchell?" asked Mr. Tan, his voice calm but curious. "I'm saying that I've added a clause to the contract," I explained. "A non-discrimination clause that states that neither party will discriminate against employees, partners, or customers on the basis of race, religion, gender, or sexual orientation." A heavy silence filled the room. I saw Richard swallow. The Singaporean executives exchanged glances. "That's unusual in a contract like this," commented Mr. Tan carefully. "Yes, it is," I agreed. "But it's important to me, because I've recently realized that I can't separate who I am from the business I do." I looked directly at him. "Mr. Tan, recently, a magazine published photos of me with another man, a man for whom I have deep feelings, a man who has taught me more about courage and authenticity than I have learned in all my years in business." The reporters at the back of the room began typing furiously on their laptops. I could imagine the headlines being created in real time. The Singaporean executives whispered among themselves, seemingly uncomfortable. I understand if this complicates our partnership, I continued, but I can no longer compartmentalize my life. If we're going to do business together, you need to accept who I am completely. Mr. Tan was silent for a long moment. Then, to my surprise, he smiled slightly. Mr. Mitchell, he said in his careful English, in Singapore we have a saying, a man who knows who he truly is the most reliable partner in business. We appreciate your honesty, even if it is unusual in our traditions. He picked up his pen. We'll sign your contract with the new clause, not because we agree with everything in your personal life, but because we respect a man who stands by his principles, even when it costs something. His words took me completely by surprise. I looked at Richard, who seemed equally shocked. Thank you, Mr. Tan, I replied, my voice slightly embarrassed. We signed the contract, took the official photos, and toasted with champagne. The reporters bombarded me with questions about my revelation, but Richard managed to keep them at bay, promising a formal interview later. As everyone began to disperse, Mr. Tan approached again. One last thought, Mr. Mitchell, he said, lowering his voice. My youngest nephew, he also has a partner. The family didn't approve at first, but we've learned that his happiness is more important than old traditions. Maybe we're not so different after all. With those words, he shook my hand and left. I stood alone in the middle of the empty room, feeling as if a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I didn't know what the future held for my company, my reputation, or even for me personally. But I did know that, for the first time in a long time, I was being true to myself. There was just one thing missing. After signing the contract, I went straight to Mike's workshop. His assistant, Diego, was there, but there was no sign of him. He's still traveling, Diego informed me, looking uncomfortable. Where did he go? Diego hesitated. I'm not sure I should tell you. Please, I insisted. It's important. Something in my expression must have convinced him. He went to the Pacific coast, he finally revealed. By motorcycle. He said he needed to think, clear his head. The Pacific coast. A solitary journey through epic landscapes. So typical of Mike, facing his emotions on the road under the open sky. When is he coming back? I don't know, Diego answered honestly. It could be weeks. It could be months. I thanked him and left the workshop, feeling lost. I had finally made the right choice, but perhaps it was too late. In the days that followed, my revelation became news in all the major media. Some criticized, others applauded my courage. The company's shares fluctuated briefly but soon stabilized. Richard was surprised by the amount of support I received, from employees, other entrepreneurs, even investors. Apparently, authenticity is valued in business these days, he commented, still looking slightly shocked. But none of that mattered. Without Mike, success seemed empty. I tried calling him countless times, but his cell phone was out of range. I sent emails that went unanswered. I began to wonder if he would ever come back, or if I had lost my chance forever. 3 weeks later, I was at home on a Friday evening working on my laptop when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, my heart stopped. Mike was there, his hair longer, his beard unshaven, his skin tanned by the highway sun. He wore his worn leather jacket and held his helmet under his arm. His green eyes had the same intense glint I remembered, but there was something new in them, a determination I didn't recognize. Can I come in? He asked simply. I nodded wordlessly, taking a step to the side. He entered and stood in the middle of the room, looking around as if to check if anything had changed. You're back, I finally managed to say. I arrived today, he replied. Diego told me about the press conference, about the contract. Mike, Why did you do that? He interrupted, his eyes fixed on mine. I took a deep breath. Because I realized that no deal is worth it if I have to deny who I am or who I love in order to have it. The word love hung between us, loaded with meaning. You risked everything, he said, his voice softer now. No, I disagreed. I almost lost everything by trying not to risk anything. He took a step towards me. The Singaporeans could have given up, but they didn't, I replied. Sometimes people surprise you when you give them the chance. Another step, and now we were close enough to feel each other's warmth. On the Pacific coast, he began, I spent days alone, crossing places where there was nothing but sky and land. I spent a lot of time thinking about us. And? I asked, my heart racing. And I realized that perhaps I had been unfair to you, he admitted. I demanded that you make choices that I never had to make. I grew up knowing exactly who I am, without billions at stake, without a public image to protect. You weren't unfair, I argued. You were honest, and you needed it. Mike smiled slightly. Still, I think I left too quickly. I should have stayed and fought for us. I'm glad you're back, I said, my voice almost a whisper. He reached up and touched my face, his thumb gently tracing my jaw, the same gesture as the first time we kissed. I don't know if this can work, he admitted. We're from such different worlds. Maybe that's exactly why it works, I replied. You show me what really matters. I show you possibilities you never imagined. His eyes shone with something that looked like hope. The tycoon and the mechanic, he muttered. An unlikely combination, I agreed. But perhaps perfect, he added, leaning in to kiss me. The kiss was different this time, deeper, more meaningful, like a new beginning. When we broke apart, our foreheads rested against each other, breathing the same air. So what happens now? He asked, his voice husky. Now, I replied, we build something new, together, something that's not your world or mine, but ours. It's going to be complicated, he warned. The best fixes always are, I replied, using one of his mechanical metaphors. He laughed, that sound I'd missed so much, and pulled me closer. I think I'm going to need a bigger garage, he joked, for all those luxury cars. And I'll need to learn how to ride a motorcycle properly, I retorted. We've got time, he said, his eyes full of promise. All the time in the world. That night, as we made love with an intensity born of separation and reunion, I knew I had made the right choice. The road ahead would be challenging, two such different worlds trying to coexist. There would be obstacles, prejudices, adjustments. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about control or perfection. Mike had taught me that true freedom lay in accepting unpredictability, in embracing the unexpected, the tycoon and the mechanic. An unlikely romance that began with a broken Lamborghini and ended up breaking all my rules, and I wouldn't change a thing. A year later, the sun was setting over the California coast as we drove along Highway 1 in a Porsche convertible. Mike at the wheel, me in the passenger seat, the wind ruffling our hair. His hand rested on my thigh, a casual gesture of intimacy that never failed to warm me up inside. What do you think of that one? He asked, pointing to a property for sale overlooking the ocean. Perfect for weekends, I replied, as long as it has a garage big enough for your projects. He smiled, that same smile that had won me over from day one, and close enough to an airport for your international meetings. A lot had changed in that year. Mike had expanded his workshop, now one of the most respected in New York for luxury cars. I was still running my financial empire, but with a new perspective, delegating more, balancing work and personal life better. We bought a house together with a spacious garage for him and an office overlooking the garden for me. Our relationship wasn't perfect. We still had occasional arguments about our different worlds. Mike still found some of my business friends unbearably boring, and I sometimes felt out of place at weekend meetings with his mechanic friends. But we learned to value these differences, to see how they complemented us. Do you know what I'm thinking? Asked Mike, slowing down to better appreciate the sunset. I'm thinking about how that broken Lamborghini was the best thing that ever happened in my life. I smiled, entwining my fingers in his. And I'm thinking about how grateful I am that you were so annoyingly arrogant that first day. He laughed, that free laugh I loved. Annoying? Me? You're the one who came in demanding immediate service as if you owned the world. And you put me in my place, I admitted. Just what I needed. Mike stopped the car at a viewpoint. The sun was almost disappearing over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He turned to me, his face softened by the golden light. 1 year together, he murmured. Who knew? A lot of people bet against us, I reminded him. But here we are, he added, leaning in to kiss me. The kiss still had the same effect on me, butterflies in my stomach, my heart racing, That feeling that everything in the world was exactly as it should be. When we broke apart, he pulled something out of his jacket pocket, a small velvet box. "What's this?" I asked, my heart beating even faster. "Open it," he suggested, a rare vulnerability in his eyes. Inside were two simple platinum rings, elegant but not ostentatious. "Mike," I began, at a loss for words. "It's not a traditional proposal," he explained. "It's more of a promise to keep building this world that is ours alone, no matter what happens." Tears welled up in my eyes. Me, who rarely showed emotion before Mike came into my life. "Yes," I answered simply. 1,000 times yes. He put one of the rings on my finger, and I did the same with his. We didn't need a formal ceremony or papers. This moment, with the ocean as a witness, was all that mattered. "I love you, Alexander Mitchell," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "with all your controlling tycoon flaws." "I love you, Mike Robinson," I replied, touching his face, "with all your annoying rebelliousness." He started the car again, and we continued our journey along the coast, the future unfolding in front of us like the endless highway. It wouldn't always be easy, but it would always be true. The tycoon and the mechanic. Two worlds that collided and, instead of destroying each other, created something entirely new. And as the last ray of sunshine disappeared over the horizon, I knew with absolute certainty that some collisions are not accidents, but the universe putting things exactly where they should be. The end. If this story has touched you in any way, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel. And remember that sometimes the most unlikely encounters are the ones that have the power to completely transform our lives. See you next time.